It was supposed to be a simple hike. I had planned it for weeks, a weekend getaway into the woods to clear my mind, enjoy some fresh air, and reconnect with nature. The last few months had been stressful, and I needed to get away from everything. I'd been going through a lot, and this quiet retreat was supposed to be a remedy for the chaos. The woods were dense, the kind of place where the trees stretch so high that the sun barely reaches the ground. The path was narrow, winding through the underbrush, but it felt peaceful. My backpack was light, my phone had enough charge for some music, and I felt the excitement of being surrounded by nature. At first, I wasn't worried about getting lost. After all, how hard could it be to follow a trail? But as the hours passed, something started to feel off. The trail seemed to disappear in places, and the path I had been following became less and less clear. The trees looked the same in every direction, and the sounds of the forest grew quieter, almost too quiet. I pulled out my phone, but the signal was weak, and there was no map of the area. The silence pressed in on me, and for the first time, I realized how far I had strayed from the main path. Panic set in. I tried retracing my steps, but it was no use. Every direction looked the same. I called out, hoping someone might hear me, but the only response was the rustling of leaves in the wind. I felt my heart rate pick up. The sunlight was starting to fade, and the woods, which had once felt peaceful, now seemed oppressive. I wandered for what felt like hours, but it was hard to tell. The trees blurred together, the shadows grew longer, and I was losing my sense of time. My water bottle was almost empty, and the realization that I was completely lost sank in like a stone in my chest. That's when I saw him. He was standing a few yards away, almost hidden among the trees, looking like he had appeared out of nowhere. His presence was strange, yet oddly reassuring. He was tall, with a weathered look about him, as though he had spent a lot of time in the woods. His clothes were rugged, a flannel shirt, worn jeans, and boots that seemed made for this kind of terrain. The odd thing was, I hadn't heard him approach, and he didn't look like someone who was lost. "Lost, huh?" he asked in a calm, steady voice. I nodded, my throat dry. "Yeah, I've been trying to find my way back for hours." He looked at me for a moment, sizing me up, before offering a slight smile. "Don't worry. I know these woods like the back of my hand. I'll get you to the road." Relief washed over me, though I couldn't help but wonder how he had managed to find me so quickly, or how he had appeared so suddenly. But I didn't question it. I just wanted out of the woods. "Thank you," I said, my voice a little shaky. I was starting to think I was never going to make it out. "No problem," he replied. "Follow me." We started walking, and as we did, the oddest thing happened. The more we walked, the more at ease I felt. The tension I'd been holding on to since I first realized I was lost began to dissipate. The path ahead seemed clearer, and his presence made me feel like everything was going to be okay. We chatted as we walked, about nothing important, just small talk. He seemed normal enough, though I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something a little too perfect about the way he moved through the woods. His pace was steady, assured. Like he had done this 1,000 times before. We talked about the weather, and how he'd spent years hiking through these woods, and then, as though it were nothing out of the ordinary, he mentioned that he never left the forest. He was a part of it, in a way. I found that statement strange, but in the moment, I brushed it off. I wasn't in the mood to question someone who was helping me get out of this nightmare. After what seemed like an eternity, we emerged from the trees. The road was ahead of us, and I could finally see the sky in the distance. I turned to thank him, but before I could say anything, he gave me a small, almost sad smile. "I'll head back," he said, nodding toward the forest. "Take care of yourself." I opened my mouth to say something, but he was already walking back into the woods, disappearing among the trees as if he had never been there at all. I stood there for a moment, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. The road stretched out before me, and I started walking, eager to find help. I wasn't sure how long I had been lost, but now that I was on the right path, I figured it wouldn't take long to find someone. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That brief encounter with the stranger had been so odd, and yet, it felt like it was meant to happen. I tried to push the thought away, but it lingered. When I finally encountered the rescue team, they were shocked to see me. I had been missing for 3 days. They told me that the forest was vast, that it was nearly impossible for anyone to survive out there for that long without getting lost completely. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. I had been lost, yes, but I hadn't been alone. And I couldn't stop wondering, who was that man? How did he find me so quickly? How could he have known the wood so well? And more importantly, how had I gotten out of there in just a few hours when others would have perished? The question lingered in my mind, refusing to go away. And as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't help but feel that the answer to that question was something I wasn't ready to face. It was hard to shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The entire experience in the woods, from being lost to that strange encounter with the man, kept replaying in my mind over and over again. I wanted to put it behind me, to move on, but the nagging feeling lingered like an itch I couldn't scratch. The rescue team had been thorough, asking questions about my time in the forest, the areas I'd wandered through, and what I remembered about the man who had helped me. I gave them the details I could, but I left out something important, the odd sense of calm that had washed over me when I first met him. The fact that I couldn't remember hearing his footsteps or seeing him approach. I didn't mention how his presence seemed almost out of place. Instead, I simply told them he had helped me find the road. After all, I had no logical explanation for why he had been there, and I certainly didn't want to sound insane. In the days that followed, I tried to push the experience to the back of my mind. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man again, the calmness in his eyes, the way he seemed so sure of himself, like he'd done this countless times before. And every time I looked at the news reports about my missing person case, I was struck by one detail. The search had taken days, and no one had found me until I managed to stumble upon the road. Yet, this man had appeared out of nowhere and led me right to it. Something didn't add up. It was during a quiet evening, while I was sitting in my apartment, staring at the map of the forest I had used before my hike, that I decided to dig deeper. I pulled out my laptop and began researching the woods, the history of missing persons in the area, and any other incidents that might have been similar to mine. I wasn't expecting much, just hoping for some kind of logical explanation, a reason why I had found myself in the woods for so long and why that man had helped me. But what I uncovered sent a chill down my spine. There was a story about a young man named Artem, who had gone missing in the exact same forest nearly a decade ago. According to the report, he had been hiking alone when he disappeared. His search had lasted for days, much like mine. The local authorities had searched high and low, but there was no sign of him. His disappearance remained a mystery, and after weeks of investigation, the case had gone cold. But there was something even stranger in the details of the story. Several searchers had reported hearing his voice, faint calls for help coming from deep within the forest. But when they reached the spots where they thought the voice had come from, they found nothing. His body was never recovered, and no trace of him was ever found. As I read through the details of the case, a strange thought crossed my mind. The man who had helped me, was he Artem? I couldn't explain why, but something about the way he spoke, the way he moved through the forest, felt eerily familiar. It was as if he had lived there his entire life. As if he had been part of the woods. I spent hours that night researching anything I could find about Artem. I dug through local news archives, police records, even social media profiles of his friends and family. The more I uncovered, the more certain I became that the man who had helped me was connected to Artem's disappearance. But how? Was it possible that he had returned to the woods, a ghost, still trapped in the place where he had vanished all those years ago? I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way he had appeared so suddenly, as if out of thin air, the way he had seemed so calm and confident, it was too much of a coincidence. There was no logical explanation, no reasonable answer. The next day, I returned to the forest. It felt like the only place where I might find more answers, where the truth might reveal itself. As I walked along the edge of the woods, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. The trees loomed around me, casting long shadows in the fading light of day. The same oppressive silence I had felt when I was lost began to creep back, wrapping around me like a cold blanket. I followed the path I had taken during my hike, walking slowly, trying to piece together the events in my mind. It was as if the forest itself held the answers, but they were hidden, just beyond my reach. My heart started to race, and a sense of unease settled over me. It was then that I heard it. A voice. Faint at first, like a whisper on the wind, but growing clearer with each passing second. It was a voice I recognized. It was the man from the woods, his calm, steady voice calling my name. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The voice didn't answer, but the rustling in the trees grew louder, as if something, or someone, was moving through the forest. I felt a chill run down my spine. I had to leave. I turned to walk back toward the road, but the forest felt different now, as if it was alive, watching me. The voice echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the thought that Artem's spirit was still there, in those woods, still trying to guide others out, just as he had guided me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The voice I had heard in the forest lingered in my mind, like a persistent echo bouncing off the walls of my thoughts. Artem's voice. I was sure of it now. But how? How could this be happening? I couldn't deny the connection anymore. It wasn't just coincidence. The man who had helped me was tied to this forest in a way I couldn't fully understand, and the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that he wasn't alive. That evening, as I lay in bed, my phone buzzed with a new message. I had almost forgotten about the group chat with my friends. They had been asking for updates ever since the rescue. I opened the message, half expecting more questions about how I had gotten lost and why I hadn't been more careful. But this message was different. "Hey, did you hear about that guy, Artem? The one who disappeared in the forest 10 years ago? They found his body." The message sent a jolt through me, and I sat up in bed. They found his body? But they never had before. The case had gone cold, and his disappearance had always been a mystery. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I read the message again, the words dancing in front of my eyes. I immediately Googled it, my fingers trembling as I searched for more information. Sure enough, there were several recent news articles about Artem's body being discovered deep in the forest. The search party had found his remains a few days before I was rescued, hidden in a place no one had thought to look. But what caught my eye wasn't the discovery itself, it was the manner of his death. The report said that Artem had died from exposure, but the circumstances surrounding his death were strange. He hadn't been alone when he died, at least, that's what the searchers suspected. A few witnesses claimed to have heard faint cries coming from the woods before his body was found. The most unsettling part, however, was a note that had been found near his remains, written in his handwriting. The note simply read, "The woods have a way of keeping you here." My stomach turned. The words felt like a message, a warning, and a confirmation all at once. Artem had left something behind, something meant for anyone who came after him, anyone who might find themselves lost in those woods. I couldn't stop thinking about the man I had met, the man who had guided me out. The same man who had disappeared from the news for years, and now I was hearing reports that his body had been found. Had I met Artem's spirit? Was it possible that the man who saved me wasn't alive at all, but was instead a part of the forest itself, a lingering presence that still tried to help those who got lost? I needed answers, but I didn't know where to begin. So, I went back to the forest. The sun was setting when I arrived, casting long shadows between the trees. The familiar smell of pine and damp earth filled the air, but there was something different about it today. The forest felt more alive, more aware of my presence, like the trees themselves were watching me. I stood at the edge of the woods for a long moment, hesitant, before I stepped forward, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots the only sound in the silence. I retraced my steps, walking through the dense underbrush, my mind racing with questions. Was Artem's spirit still here? Had he been the one to find me, to lead me out of the woods? And if he had, why had he done it? Was it an act of kindness, or was it something else, something darker? The deeper I went into the forest, the more I felt a strange pull. It wasn't physical, but something intangible, like a force drawing me deeper into the heart of the woods. My skin prickled, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Every step I took seemed to take me closer to some hidden truth, something I wasn't sure I wanted to find. Then, as I walked between two large trees, I saw something. A shape. It was him, the man from the woods. He was standing there, just ahead, as if waiting for me. The same calm expression on his face, the same quiet presence that had both comforted and unsettled me during our first encounter. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. This time, I didn't call out. I just stood there, staring at him. He hadn't moved. He just looked at me, his eyes calm, almost knowing. "You've come to understand, haven't you?" he said, his voice low and steady. I nodded, though I couldn't find the words to speak. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. "You were lost," he continued. "I found you, just like I found him. Just like I found others before you." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I stepped back, instinctively wanting to escape. But I couldn't move. It was as if my feet were rooted to the ground, held in place by an unseen force. "Why?" I finally managed to croak. "Why did you help me? Are you Artem?" The man's expression didn't change, but I could see the faintest flicker of something in his eyes, something ancient and sorrowful. "I was once lost here too," he said softly. "But I never made it out. I never got to see the world again. I couldn't save myself, so now I help others. But not everyone is lucky enough to leave." I swallowed hard, the realization sinking in like a weight on my chest. "You're not alive, are you?" He didn't answer, but his eyes told me everything I needed to know. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving me standing there, alone in the forest. I didn't go back to the forest after that encounter. I couldn't. The sight of the man, Artem, or whatever he was, haunted me in ways I couldn't explain. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his calm expression, and his words echoed in my mind, like a warning that I didn't yet fully understand. In the days that followed, I tried to push the memories away, to return to some semblance of normalcy. I went about my routine, working, meeting friends, trying to live my life like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I wasn't the same person who had gotten lost in that forest. A part of me, something deep within me, knew that I would never truly escape what I had seen. I started reading about Artem, digging into his past, trying to uncover any possible connection between him and the strange events I had experienced. What I found disturbed me even more. The more I read, the more the details began to blur the line between reality and the supernatural. Artem had disappeared 10 years ago, a regular young man from a nearby town, heading into the woods for a hike. No one had heard from him for days, and despite extensive search efforts, his body was never found. Some speculated that he had fallen, others thought he might have gotten lost and succumbed to the elements. But no one had ever found an answer, and his family was left with nothing but questions. But then, as I researched further, I came across a strange detail. Artem had once told a friend that he felt a pull in the forest, a feeling that something was waiting for him there. He had said it jokingly at first, but his friend remembered him saying it again just before he disappeared. There were also whispers about a local legend, a story about a spirit who wandered the forest, helping lost souls find their way, but only those who were truly lost. The more I read, the more certain I became that the man I had met was not alive. But the question remained, why had he helped me? Was I truly lost, or had something else been at play? The events began to blur together in my mind. Artem, the disappearance, the spirit in the forest, and the chilling words he had spoken to me. I was once lost here too, but I never made it out. His words kept playing over and over, and I couldn't stop thinking about them. It was one evening, a few days after my return, when I sat alone in my apartment, scrolling through the pages I had bookmarked in my search for answers, that I noticed something odd. I had stumbled upon a news article from a few years ago, one I had missed before. It was a short piece about a young man found dead in the same woods where Artem had disappeared. His cause of death? It was officially ruled as an accident, drowning in the nearby creek, but there was one detail in the article that caught my attention. The man's name was Dmitry, and he had been with a group of friends, hiking near the same area where Artem had vanished. The most chilling part, however, was the photograph that accompanied the article. In the background, among the trees, I could see a figure standing, half hidden, but unmistakable. It was the same man I had met in the forest. Artem. But this photo was taken years before I ever set foot in the woods. It wasn't just Artem's spirit I had encountered. There was something more, something far more sinister at play. I felt a cold chill spread through me as I stared at the photograph. A wave of realization hit me hard. Artem's death wasn't an accident. He had become a part of the forest, just like Dmitry had. And I had been standing there, in the same place, caught between the living and the dead. I had to go back. I had to see the place where it had all started. That night, I grabbed my jacket and set out toward the forest, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick with unease, the moon casting eerie shadows across the path as I made my way deeper into the woods. I could hear the rustling of the leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, but everything felt muffled, like the forest was holding its breath. As I reached the spot where Artem had found me, I stopped. There was a strange stillness here, like the trees themselves were waiting. The wind had died down, and the usual sounds of wildlife seemed distant, almost non-existent. I stood there, listening, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on me. And then I heard it. A soft whisper. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was faint, barely audible, but it was there, coming from somewhere just ahead. It sounded like Artem. I moved forward, drawn by the voice, until I reached the clearing. The trees around me seemed to bend inward, like they were closing in on me. And in the center of the clearing, standing beneath a thick oak, was the man I had seen before. Artem. His face was calm, but his eyes were filled with sorrow, as if he had been waiting for me to come to this moment. "You should have stayed away," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper against the wind. I took a step back, my heart racing. "What is this? What do you want from me?" "I'm just a part of the forest now," Artem replied, his gaze distant. "Just like Dmitry. Just like all the others who got lost here." I looked around, panic rising in my chest. The trees seemed to shift, and for a moment, I thought I saw figures moving between the shadows. Faces. The spirits of the lost. "You're not real," I gasped, my voice shaking. "You can't be. You're dead." Artem's expression softened. "We're all dead, in a way. The forest never lets go. It's too late for me. But you still have a chance to leave." "How?" I demanded, my voice raw. "You have to let go of the past," he whispered. "You have to forget me. Forget this place. And walk away." I took a shaky breath and looked around. The faces in the trees seemed to watch me, their eyes filled with longing and fear. It was like they were waiting for me to make a decision, but I couldn't. "You're a part of it now too," Artem said. "You will always be part of it. And so will I." I turned, running back toward the trail. The forest seemed to shift around me, as though it was trying to keep me here. But I didn't look back. Not this time. It took me days to shake the feeling that the forest still held me in its grip. No matter how far I traveled, how many distractions I tried to find, the memory of that night lingered like a shadow, always watching from just behind my shoulder. The whisper of Artem's voice in the woods echoed in my mind, and the faces of the lost souls that seemed to inhabit the trees haunted me in the quiet moments. But I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep pretending that the world I had returned to was the same. I had seen too much, learned too much. And as much as I wished it were otherwise, I knew deep down that I would never be free of it. The forest had marked me, and I would always carry its weight, even if I never stepped foot near it again. I spent the next few days in a haze of research and contemplation. I read more about the disappearances in that forest. I scoured online forums and articles, trying to piece together whatever information I could find. The stories of lost hikers, strange disappearances, and odd sightings of figures in the trees seemed to grow by the day. But there was no definitive answer, no conclusion that explained what I had experienced. That's when I decided to visit the local archives. The building was quiet, almost eerily so, the air thick with the smell of old paper and dust. I sat at one of the tables, sifting through the stacks of local newspapers and missing person reports. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find, but a part of me knew I was searching for something that would make sense of the chaos in my mind. I found it. An old newspaper article from 10 years ago, tucked away in a yellowing folder, caught my attention. It wasn't about Artem, but about a young man named Dmitri. The article told the story of Dmitri's disappearance, the same forest, the same circumstances. He had been hiking with friends, just like Artem had. He had disappeared without a trace, and his body was never found. But the most chilling detail was the photograph. It showed Dmitri's group, standing together in front of a trailhead near the same spot where I had gotten lost. The group appeared happy, unaware of the fate that awaited them. But there, in the background, was a figure, a man standing just out of focus, his face partially hidden behind a tree. I blinked, my blood running cold. It was Artem. The same man I had met in the woods. The same man who had saved me. I pulled the article closer, scanning the text for more information. The photo was taken years before I had even stepped into that forest, but there he was, standing in the background as if he had always been there. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. Artem wasn't alive. He couldn't have been. He was a part of something darker, something that had bound him to the forest. He had been one of the lost souls, just like Dmitri. And in his restless state, he had found me, another lost soul, offering me guidance in exchange for his own redemption. But why? Why had he helped me? I thought back to his words, "You have to let go of the past." He had known. He had known that I was destined to join the others, to become just another ghost in that forest. But by helping me, by guiding me out, he had hoped to free himself from his own torment. I stood up from the table, my head spinning. The air felt thick, as if the weight of all the secrets that had been hidden for so long was finally pressing down on me. I had to go back. I had to confront it one last time. I drove back to the edge of the forest, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The place felt like a different world now, one I had once walked through naively, without understanding the truth that lingered just beneath the surface. The trees whispered in the wind, and I could almost hear the voices of the lost, calling out to me. I didn't stop at the usual entrance. I drove deeper into the woods, following the path I had taken when I was lost. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The air grew heavy, suffocating. It was as though the forest was alive, watching me, waiting. And then I saw him. Artem stood at the edge of the clearing, just like he had before. His face was calm, but his eyes were filled with something different this time, regret, perhaps. I wasn't sure. But he didn't speak. He didn't need to. I stepped forward, heart pounding, the realization settling in. "You knew I would come back," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded slowly. "I knew. But you don't belong here anymore. You've seen too much." "Why?" I asked, the question burning in my chest. "Why did you help me? You were one of them. Why not leave me to my fate?" Artem didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted to the trees, as if he were searching for something, or someone. "I was lost once too," he said quietly. "I couldn't leave anyone else to suffer the way I did. The forest, it keeps us here, but we don't have to be its prisoners. Not forever. I saved you, because I didn't want you to become like me. But what about you?" I asked, feeling the weight of his words. "Are you free?" Artem's expression softened, but there was a sadness in his eyes that I could never forget. "No. But you can be." I took a step back, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. I had been marked by the forest, but there was a choice now. I could walk away. I could leave this place behind and never look back. Artem took one last look at me, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he turned away and vanished into the trees. I didn't look back. As I left the forest behind, I felt the heavy weight lift from my chest, the tightness in my throat easing with each step. It was over. But even as I walked away, I knew I would never truly escape it. The forest, the spirits, the memory of Artem, they would always be with me, lurking in the shadows. And somewhere deep inside, I knew that one day, when the time came, I would return.